Oi oi, hello and welcome to Dream Space with me, Gemma Cairney. I'm a writer, a broadcaster, definitely a dreamer, and I'm currently very pregnant. So if you're listening to this, surprise, I am now on maternity leave or having a baby. But the Dream Space keeps on dreaming even if I'm not sort of physically here. It can happen with art, technology and futurism. Every episode, we invite a dreamer into our sonic canvas to take over our imaginations, creating their ultimate dream space with their ideas for a better tomorrow. I have a mirage of different elements and naturous joy that has stayed with me from this series, from speaking to Gazelle twins' dream of an intentional community where we have space to play and make art and be immersed in craft on a regular basis for everybody, which really beautifully correlates with David Hoyle, who really had an anarchic and radical determination to demand that we can access our creativity, but taking it the next step further onto a new planet. To speaking to my friend Zoe Ashton, who is just at a beautiful place in her life and really gave us a new sense of family in her dream. I mean, this is just so dreamy, excuse me for the pun, to be a part of. Usually you have me along for the ride asking the questions, but you'll have to step into the dream space without me for this particular journey. If you missed me too much though, then you can go back and listen to earlier episodes of the series. We've been transported to the dream spaces of DJ Paulette, Hatain Patel, Gazelle Twin and more. They've all been remarkable. Today, you're going to be transported to the dream space of...
Hi everybody, my name is Kee Hong Low. I'm the creative director at Factory International. In the role that I'm in right now, it asks you to be creative. It asks you to imagine things otherwise. And the first thing I acknowledge is that I don't do this alone. I rely on artists. I rely on people around me who are just as insistent on entering into the dream space. It's a role that in some ways function as somewhat like a glue to encourage all these different perspectives, that each and every one of them is valid in their own right, and that to kind of look at other types of patterns that maybe is not as obvious, but also more importantly for me, it is a way by which you continue to insist on the space for experimentation, on the space to dream. How I see my role is to insist that we protect the spaces for dreaming, because the moment we lose that, I fear that we would lose all hope. We would lose all possibilities of anything else beyond what we know right now. This constant journey into the dream space and then coming back to this quote-unquote real world is also an important kind of process, because what it does is that it's constantly that process of healing, recognizing also the shift in yourself, because also getting lost all the time in that dream space might be difficult. I'm a dreamer. I spend a lot of time in the dream space because for me it's the way I get to nourish myself. It's the way that I get to kind of transcend beyond the here and now, and it's super important to me. It's kind of a space that I retreat to, especially when I need things to get me going, to kind of extract my mind above and beyond, the immediate that's kind of around me. Sometimes when I wake up, in an instant I try to note it mentally. so that I hold on to the essence of what it was. But what I've also noticed is that the content of the dreams or the structure of the dreams will always return. It will always find me. It will always creep into my thoughts when I'm awake. It will always seep into the conversations that I'm having. So sometimes the reality and the dream space blurs, which I love. I don't like to keep things separate, and so when they start to have kind of bizarre conversations with each other, that's my comfort zone. We live in a world that's challenging, and it's putting a lot of kind of pressures and stress on us, and I think the dream space, it feels more and more critical and necessary. It's a space where you allow your mind to wander without a purpose. It creates something that connects the past, present, and future in ways that you also unfamiliar with. What if time is not linear nor circular, that is stacked upon each other, that you can cut through back and forth easily? Suddenly then your mind is able to transcend above the kind of storms that you feel and you encounter every day, and then this allows you to see much further. And that is for me what my dream space looks like. You're above the storm clouds, above the turbulent zone, and then you can see far and wide. The storm is very seductive. It will constantly seduce you to want to engage with it, to want to solve it, to want to have a conversation with it, to want to insist that that is the only conversation you can have. But then the more you let go right at the beginning, you kind of puncture through that storm almost like a rocket ship, so that the first thing you see is this expansiveness, so that your curious mind will then start to figure things out, start to follow in multiple ways, so that it doesn't insist on any particular thing. So that for me, it's probably how best to prepare to enter the dream space. It looks vast, it feels like it's endless, and it's calm. You can't see where the horizon is. It can feel quite uncomfortable because you don't seem to have any point of navigation, but at the same time, you know that you're held, you know that you're somewhere safe, because your thoughts and where your mind can go is without restriction. It's not stressed. It's not asking you to decide or to move in particular ways. It allows your mind to move in ways that you never imagined that your mind could go. I'm not sure whether it's full of color all the time. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just sepia. Sometimes there's an interesting golden hue, maybe. But it depends on how and when you enter into this dream space. But what it does is that it invites you to be brave, to go bigger, to look further. And it asks you to know that you are enough, that you don't have to prove anything. But also more importantly, it asks you to always be open, to always allow the unexpected to guide you. There is something also about smell that creates a very different kind of experience. And as we grow up, we encounter more and more different ways of smelling things, different ways of encountering things that tickle the senses. And I'm always curious about what if in the dream space the smell is done through the skin, because the skin is the largest organ in your body and it's got the maximum surface in this shape and form that we exist right now. So what if the sense of smell is encountered so differently? And when we were all young children, we see the world differently. We conflate sound, light. And even for me, our friends and colleagues who identify as neurodivergent, it's wired differently, and then you encounter things differently. And that for me is a superpower. Being in the dream space and guided by my neurodivergent friends, by young kids, that for me is a picture of joy. Sometimes when I enter the dream space, I'm alone with my thoughts, I'm alone with how I process things. But also there are other people there, other energies, other beings that I'm not sure what or who they are, but it's nice to be in their presence. You know how sometimes when things enter your body and you're very unsure about what it is, but you can feel like there's something changing in your body, and that's at once can be destabilizing, can be uncomfortable, but at the same time, I also take comfort that something is changing. And for me, I think in the encounters of the unknown, of other types of energies that you're not familiar with, you give this permission to yourself to change and to transform. And I think that is an important thing about the dream space, that, when you enter it, something happens, and when you leave the dream space, you come out on the other end. Hopefully, the dial has shifted. That's an important, I think, quality of the dream space, I think. When you first enter the dream space, it's really the first step of letting go. That image I painted earlier about rising above the storm, when your feet is not standing on anything, it's the first step of letting go, of staring almost fear in its face and says, okay, that's the first step. And the more we let go, the more we allow ourselves not to be bound by the limits of the everyday. And we live in a world that insists on limitations, because it insists on ways of control, it insists on ways by which we're all organized. Everything is organized. It needs to be part of some kind of a machinery. We live in times of late capitalism, and we're all part of a larger data minefield, if you will. And how the data flows and how it's augmented, how it's organized, how algorithms dictate everything that we do now. It feels like we're all trapped, right? There is no escape button. And that's where that dream space needs to kind of come in and kick in a very strong way, because the first step is to acknowledge that you're more than just a data set. And actually that consciousness, that ability to kind of float and rise above certain consciousness is that moment that you kind of let go of existing structures, that when you return to the structures, you acknowledge their presence and you see perhaps even more clearly how they work, how they insist on certain things. And that's when another phase of letting go happens, when you say, no, I'm walking away. It's also moving away from even frameworks about the collective, because sometimes the collective feels like it needs to move towards one thing. But I've lived through moments where this one singular thing has been completely detrimental to how we can be together. So for me, that collective space, I refer to a very small essay that a fellow curator and I, we allowed ourselves to be guided by that to think about curating in the future. And so this piece of writing is by Walter Benjamin, who wrote a very small essay around library and collection. So usually when we think about a library or collection that's built by the collector or the owner, everything is collected from that perspective. So we started asking, what if each time a book or an idea or an artist or a thinker is introduced to the collection or to the collective, it changes the collective. So that constantly we allow space for new imaginations, new thoughts, new ways of thinking to continually shift how we're talking about being together. That there's not a singular thing, but is also more than just a multiple. So the sense of the ego is almost removed, if you will, right? And usually when you think about collaboration, the idea of negotiation starts to follow suit very close by. So what if in collaboration, it means that you totally empty yourself and allow the other person to fill you? And so therefore, that again shifts what's possible. And so for me, the collective is never singular, but the collective also recognizes the multiple. And to allow that communal body to constantly move. And that for me is such a powerful image, because it also means that the collective does not stand still. It doesn't stay still on one thing, but it keeps moving, like some other engine, some other force, some other thing that gets you to a place that you still don't have a name for it. Sometimes we think about time as somewhat cogent and somewhat finite. But actually, for me, the best way to describe it is that it's porous and yet elastic. And so it can fold upon itself. It can loop in a way that doesn't end up in the beginning, but ends up somewhere else. But at the same time, you are presented with multiple entry points and multiple exit points. I mean, this may sound all completely like bonkers when you think about it, right? Like, how the hell am I going to navigate this? But that's the point. It's in the letting go, is that you do not have to concern yourself about any fixed points, because this is the total opposite of what we encounter in the everyday. And that's when hope starts to disappear, because when it feels like there is no solution, when it feels like you're at the end, that's when it becomes super bleak. But then in how we've been talking about the dream space, it is in its most extreme moments, it's where something else happens, and where for me, in the dream space, hope exists in abundance. Joy is also important, and sometimes you find joy in the most unexpected of places. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's very simple things, sometimes they're very big things. I think for me, joy comes when there's a recognition that things will be better, things can get better, that together, and when I say together, it doesn't only mean the human species, but together with everything around us, what we term quote-unquote living and non-living, that together it feels like you can find and redefine ways of being together. Being with a tree, being with a mountain, being with a bird, being with another human person, being with water. They're all important ways to discover joy. And so the inspiration will follow, I feel. I think sometimes it's hard to look for inspiration or try to seek out inspiration, but sometimes they come when it's least expected, and I think usually that is the most powerful, because when you least expect it, it opens an additional space for you to think about something differently. And that for me is kind of both a very practical and real way to think about it, but at the same time, it continues to allow for that kind of almost amorphous dream space that we've been talking about. This constant journey into the dream space and then coming back to this quote-unquote real world is also an important kind of process, because what it does is that it's constantly that process of healing, recognizing also the shift in yourself, because also getting lost all the time in that dream space might be difficult. So my ideal real world situation is when the divide between the dream space and the real world cease to exist. That in a way, collectively, we are swimming in this sense of hope, sense of possibilities, that we recognize the current existing structures it's not the end. It's not the only way to do things. And so sometimes I use a very different analogy to think about things. I use a lot the analogy of the virus. Dreamers should function like viruses, infecting everything around them. And then it starts to shift all of it without the collective body even knowing. A body, when it's infected with the virus, it needs to recalibrate itself to a new state of homeostasis, and this new state means that body has shifted. You have built antibodies, which is why it's important that we celebrate dreamers, we celebrate artists, we celebrate thinkers, we celebrate people who are not satisfied with the now, who are not satisfied with just what's in front of you. The more dreamers we have to infect in the real world around you, things will shift quite dramatically, I think, quite beautifully, and again in ways that you can't predict. I work a lot in the space of speculative futures, and so dreaming and working in the space of the prefigurative, if you will, is kind of super important. It's also meaning that you're operating in a space where the language is not obvious, when the vocabulary to describe something is not quite there. You're still searching for what it is. And so in that sense, for me, working in the space of speculation, I also tend to rely a lot on knowledge systems that are very unfamiliar to me, on types of thinking, on systems, and worldviews and cosmologies that are so far and distant from me. So which is why I love to be around my indigenous friends and communities, because they open my mind in ways that I can never imagine, and that has become a very important kind of regular thing for me, to have the privilege and to be invited into that space, into that community, into that thinking. There's so much that you can be taught, there's so much that you can see beyond what you're used to and what you're familiar with, and it blows your mind. It changes the structures in your brain. Sometimes you have to invent the Lego bricks to start to build these new structures, other ways to kind of see and think about things and to speak about things. So for me, in worlds that I'm very unfamiliar with are also something very attractive. Quite some time ago, I have a regular conversation with a friend of mine from Australia who's an indigenous activist and artist, performance maker. And one of the first things that I learned was when he was telling me how in what we do in arts and culture, what if our relationship was not about transaction, but something relational? And that for me connected very nicely to also a lot of the work I've been doing in the space of queering, in the space of also leaning into chosen families and all of that. And so what this means essentially is that the relationships are for life. The exchange is not just because there's a transaction of maybe resources with time to whatever, but that it completely recalibrates how we can be a very different community. And this is the norm in a lot of indigenous communities, that it's relational. The relationship between the current generation and your elders is very rich. That kind of thinking also allows me to draw comfort in thinking about a lot of the problems that we're facing ecologically. It feels overwhelming at many times, but actually the moment you start to rethink your relationship with land, sky, sea, earth, flora, fauna in ways that it's not about possession, that completely blew my mind, when I first encountered a lot of this kind of way of describing the world around you and relationships with each other. It goes far deeper and allows you to wonder in scales of temporality that is like mind-blowing.
Wow, what quite literally a dreamy and beautiful journey we've been on. I'm Gemma Cairney, and you've been listening to Dream Space from Factory International. Being the bold initiator of dreams, as I have been in my role as part of Dream Space, has been truly inspiring. I genuinely feel honoured to speak to such a multitude of different thinkers who work in different forms but somehow are connected to a deep sense of hope. I think by proxy it's given me so much hope as somebody who tries to be optimistic and futuristic in my approach, but also conscious that there is so much to fight against, or at least unpick, in terms of how conditioned we are in society to not dream, has felt on a soul level very invigorating and reminded me that actually we are all artists, we all have a mind and a heart, we are all deep thinkers. If you've enjoyed this episode or any of the episodes that you've come across, make sure that you like and subscribe to find more. Your support really does mean a lot to us, and we can keep you updated on what the future is of this series. You can head to Factory International's website to find out more exciting artistic content on Factory Plus. And if this is your first taste of the Dream Space universe, thank you for joining us. Do check out previous episodes in the series with Amir Nazir Zuabi, Ryan Gander, Benji Reed, Afra Deutsch, David Hoyle, Gazelle Twin, Zoe Ashton, Hatain Patel and DJ Paula, as well as Series 1 with guests including Maxine Peake, Danielle Braithwaite-Shirley, Nabia Iqbal and Scotty. There are some absolute delights in these conversations. At this moment, I ask you, what has Dream Space done to your mind? Has it inspired you to give in to dreaming more? And maybe, do we feel enough hope, thanks to our Dream Space thinkers, to put some of these dreams into reality? Let's continue the conversation. Let us know. Dream Space was hosted by me, Gemma Cairney, and this episode was produced by Sylvia Malnati, with sound design by Femi Oriogun Williams and theme music by Andrew P.M. Hunt. The executive producer is Kit Callan, and this is a reduced listening production for Factory International, curated by Scott Smith and Alex Mannion Jones. Until next time.